as you come to understand gold as still being the base money of central banking.
I love gold and I understand why central banks own gold.
Money needs to do 5 things. It needs to exhibit 5 properties to be good money.
A lot of people don't maybe see the problems that we even have with the money supply.
Money is a final extinguisher of debt.
People would argue that in order for an economy to grow, the money supply has to expand. And you're saying that's not correct.
Everything that we trade in society is at its base a product of human time.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Market Disruptors Show. And today I am sitting down with Robert Breedlove. Now he has been writing some amazing articles that's really taken the industry by storm, and I have been loving them. And so I can't wait to talk to him. He is the CEO and founder of Parallax Digital. He's also a new YouTuber as well. So you have to go check him out on YouTube after you're done watching this video. But Robert, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, like I said, you know, you've been writing a bunch of really, really good articles that everybody's been talking about. I've really been enjoying them. But for a lot of people who don't know who you are, why don't you give us a little bit of background on kind of what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Robert, the founder of Parallax Digital. We do a couple of things. We operate a multi-strategy crypto asset fund, and then we do some consulting in the Bitcoin space. My background before crypto was as a certified public accountant. Did a lot of tax strategy for high net worth individuals and investment partnerships. And then I also have a fairly long track record as a CFO for mostly companies in the tech space. And I had my first Bitcoin in 2014. I didn't fall down the rabbit hole though until 2016, 17, and actually took kind of a circuitous path because it was in studying Ethereum, I discovered the concept of smart contracts and read Szabo's work that was written in the late 90s on smart contracts. And when I saw his canonical example of a smart contract as a vending machine, right, where it kind of has this programmatic relationship between buyer and seller, and then he analogizes that to the entire financial system. My realization was that the whole finance industry is a giant smart contract with people operating it, that a lot of it will be absorbed by dry code at some point. That's when I got heavily involved. And then I like to say where my money went, my mind followed. And the more closely I've studied the space, the more of a Bitcoin maximalist, to use the negative term, I've become. But it's not, I think people often confuse Bitcoin maximalists for people that are just have a great deal of fanaticism about a single asset. But I think it's more of the typical result of walking a path, right? You're interested in Bitcoin, you look at a lot of these other projects and you realize that Bitcoin being disruptive to gold is the major technological advancement here. This is the major disruption that has such profound socioeconomic implications for the world as you come to understand gold as still being the base money of central banking, right? That is the instrument that they monopolize. So it's in a way that gold has always made the world go round. And now for the first time in 5,000 years, we have a technology that's potentially disruptive to gold.
Yeah. And so that's what's sucked you in, just kind of seeing that. I to your point, you know, the way I kind of look at Bitcoin maximalism is I'm also a gold maximalist, and I love gold, and I understand why central banks own gold, and I understand why gold was money for 5,000 years. Are there opportunities to invest money and make money in silver or copper or rhodium or platinum? Sure. But none of those metals will ever be gold. And maybe
That's right.
You see it kind of like that?
I do. I like to explain money through a first principles Austrian economic framework. And I'll give you the nutshell version, but money needs to do 5 things. It needs to exhibit 5 properties to be good money. It needs to be divisible. It needs to be durable. It needs to be recognizable. It needs to be portable, and it needs to be scarce. So historically, monetary metals best satisfied the first 4 properties of money. And of the monetary metals, gold was the most scarce. And that's why it was basically naturally selected on the free market as universal money. And there's never been a tool that was better than gold at storing value across time. And the reason is because no one can compromise its supply, no matter how hard we try. No matter how much mining effort was allocated towards its production, its supply tended to increase about 2% per year, which made it relied upon for pricing in the marketplace. And then central banking, on top of that, was just constructed as an institution to increase the convenience of gold, the transactional convenience, right? Because gold is heavy, it's hard it lacks in the portability and divisibility functions. So paper backed by gold actually made gold more transactional, more convenient for transaction. But over time, as we all know, that redeemability of paper into gold was revoked, culminating in the 1971 Nixon shock. And what we have today is just an uncollateralized government debt certificate that undergoes slow motion default as the societies are forced to use it.
Yeah.
So as I argue in a lot of my work, it's an institution of socialism and theft.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is at the core of many, many problems that we're seeing in the world today.
Yeah, so that's what I want to dig into today, if we can, because a lot of people don't maybe see the problems that we even have with the money supply and don't recognize that, like you just said, a lot of the problems that we have today all go back to the money supply. So in your last piece that you wrote a couple of months ago, which I encourage everyone to go read, I'll link to it in the show notes. It's called Masters and Slaves of Money. And you talked about how really, and you kind of dive into the philosophy of this, but you talk about how money and I should say the counterfeiting of money basically is stealing time. It's stealing time and labor, which is then enslaving people. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we say today, it's common to say that a central bank is printing money, but I would argue that money is a final extinguisher of debt. So it's going to be a bearer asset that's free of counterparty risk, right? That's like what gold is, what silver was. So such that when you deliver this physically possessed asset, which in an accounting perspective would be 100% equity in that asset and 0% liability, right? There's no debt attached to it, that you can satisfy and extinguish a debt with finality. But fiat currency is not that. You always are subjected to counterparty risk in the form of inflation, in the form of currency deauthorization, like we saw in India, where they just overnight turned off the 500 rupee banknote.
Mm-hmm.
And to, inflation is counterfeiting, basically. It's the legal form of counterfeiting. Counterfeiting is the illegal form of inflation. They're one and the same. So when a central bank is quote unquote printing money, what they're actually doing is counterfeiting currency, because they're creating something that was once redeemable for money, gold or silver, but today has no actual backing. So this has the effect, and I argue that the economic dynamics of this essentially make it a pyramid scheme, such that those with access to the freshly printed money can confiscate value from those who are forced to store value in fiat currency, which are
Right.
usually the poor, people on fixed income, retirees. So it's a system that victimizes the most economically vulnerable among us. And it's just really bad, right? Money is intended to be this fabric of socioeconomic trust, so such that we can interoperate with people without knowing them, right? We can just engage in commercial transactions without needing to know that person and vet their reputation. And it's something you can sacrifice your work for today, knowing that you can redeem it for similar sacrifices from others tomorrow. But when you implement theft directly into this trust fabric that we call money, it corrupts the entire system, right? So central banks, when they're printing money, it needs to be very clear that there's no value being added to the economy whatsoever. Printing new slips of dollars just reallocates the claims on private property from the bottom to the top. It doesn't create any new wealth in the economy whatsoever. So it's purely a mechanism for theft. And that was I'd say the core aim of this piece is to thoroughly destroy the concept of inflation. Like, I'm really, really tired of intelligent people arguing with me saying that inflation is necessary for a healthy economy. Monetary inflation in a centrally banked world is purely a mechanism for theft.
Yeah. Now you made a quote. You said society always slides towards slavery when the privileged few are able to produce money more cheaply than everyone else. I thought that was a great quote, and it basically kind of sums up what you're saying. But to the point you just made, and people will argue, and I see these comments on my videos all the time. And I guess this is what you're addressing. But people would argue that in order for an economy to grow, the money supply has to expand. And you're saying that's not correct.
That is absolutely false. So there's a few ways to think about this. One is money is the measurement system for value. So you could analogize this to the meter or the foot or the mile. And if the frame of reference through which you're evaluating changes itself, you actually lose, it doesn't carry as much information, right?
Mhm.
So you don't want, the ideal money supply is absolutely scarce, right? It's a perfect frame of reference that doesn't change no matter how much economic activity is changing, such that it conveys the clearest price signals, right? You know that if you, and the analogy would be, could you imagine trying to run a construction team to build a house when the actual value of a meter or a foot changed and fluctuated every day?
There'd
Like
be
you
no
couldn't
way.
coordinate, yeah, you couldn't coordinate human action across time. You would, the house would turn out terribly if it turned out at all. And that's precisely what we're doing in this current system. And the connection to time is that you, to get real first principles, everything that we trade in society is at its base a product of human time. That's every good that's produced, every service that's provided, every piece of knowledge that's exchanged. Someone spent time creating it, providing it, or figuring it out, right? And if you have a monopoly on money, which is by definition the most liquid asset in an economy, you basically have the power, and you have the power to change its supply. You have the power to confiscate time from all of those citizens that are forced to use the money.
Right.
So I hesitated, I've thought about this for a long time, but I hesitated to call central banking or fiat currency a mechanism or an institution of slavery. But the longer I thought about it, there's no other accurate term for time theft. And this is 100% certainly time theft. The central banks are stealing time from those that are relying on fiat currency as a store of value when they engage in quantitative easing.
So
And
if I if I could break that down, basically, money, it allows us. So I could work my 8 hours digging a hole, and then I get paid for that. I could decide to work 2 extra hours for extra money, and I could bank that, and then I could use that to buy time in the future. I could use that to buy someone else's labor. So someone else made these goods using their time, and I can use that to buy their time. So if the central bank is creating money for free, and they're causing people to go out and spend their time and labor to do work, and I'm basically counterfeiting money and then buying that, I'm stealing their labor. Is that kind
that's
of what you're
exactly
saying?
right. That's exactly right. Work involves sacrifice, right? You have to engage in trade-offs. I'm going to do this activity at the exclusion of these other activities. So you're sacrificing the opportunity cost, so to speak. But in the current model, central banks suffer no opportunity cost. They suffer no sacrifice necessary to produce the money. And there's no, that negates all assurances to its scarcity of supply, right?
Mhm.
That's what the cost of gold mining was. That's why gold mining was chosen, because there was a sacrifice necessary to produce it. It protected its supply from being diluted.
Yeah.
So gold would be the proper example of free market money. Fiat currency is the exact opposite, right? They produce trillions of dollars with a near effortless keystroke. There's no cost. And another way to think about this is that in the long run, the the market value of money tends to converge to its marginal cost of production. So gold, however much it costs to get it out of the ground, its market price is going to converge to that number over time. Like it'll
Right.
fluctuate in the short term, but it converges to that number over time. The cost to produce fiat currency is near zero. So
Right.
that is why its market value always historically converges to zero. There's a direct incentive to print it into absolute worthlessness. And
Right.
indeed, history proves that out. This isn't This isn't a fantastical notion that we think the US dollar is going to fail. Every fiat currency fails,
Yeah.
right? The most successful fiat currency in history is the British pound, less than 320 years old. It's lost 99.5% of its value. That's the best, that's the most successful one to date.
Right. Just because it's been around the longest, but it's also lost the most.
That's right. Just because it survived the longest. Um, but they all, and it's, it tends to go hand in hand with what power is dominant. But here now we have Bitcoin. We have this non-state digital base money that can't be inflated. It maximizes the sovereignty of its holder. It can't easily be stolen or confiscated. So it's a real game changer for the macro economy.
That piece that you just said, I want to dig in a little bit more to the philosophy, and then I want to figure out why anybody should even care about this. And then I want to dig into what we should be looking at and maybe what we should be doing to protect ourselves and even profit from this. But before, I just want to dig into that point that you just made, where it's not easy confiscatable, because this is something I've been thinking about lately, where like kind of from the beginning of time, you had to worry about like the next village over coming in and killing you and taking your stuff. And then eventually you had like kingdoms and they'd build walls and then they would protect you. And if fast forward till today, and really like the role of government is to protect the people. But in a digital future where all my wealth can be stored in an unconfiscatable digital asset, nobody can steal that. And then what do I need government for? If their only role was to protect me from the marauders coming to steal from me. So it changes everything.
That's right. That's right. And you're touching on a profound topic of Bitcoin here. So you're correct. Historically, government was the monopoly on violence that prevented violence from happening within its community such that it could protect property rights. Mm-hmm. And property rights, people often think property is the asset, the table, the equity, the car, whatever. That's not what property is. Property is the exclusive relationship between the individual and the asset, right? Such that I own my car. I know I can go out and get in my car. No one else is going to take it for a spin. I own my house. Those rights to property are protected by the government. But Bitcoin represents something really interesting. It's the first property right in history that is totally agnostic to any government decision, decree, law. And it's the only, because it's independent of government, governments can't revoke your property rights. I read this the other night. This is a quote by Carl Schmitt. Sovereign is he who can make the exception, right? So governments will honor your property rights over time, but they'll readily make exceptions to them, like quantitative easing, right? That's a violation of private property rights for everyone holding dollars. They'll do it when necessary. If it's wartime or they're bankrupt or they need to do this, eminent domain in the US, they'll confiscate your land if they decide they want to build a pipeline through it. They'll increase property taxes on your house if things get dodgy or bankruptcy. So there's always been an exception to property rights that governments have willingly leveraged to their advantage. But Bitcoin represents this almost meta property right that no one can revoke, right? It cannot be forcibly taken. You could be beaten over the head with a $5 wrench and maybe give it up, but you still have to voluntarily surrender it at some point.
Yeah.
And that's a total game changer, right? Because to your point, the whole history of humanity has been people fighting over the stuff, largely the money, the resources, the food. But for the first time in history, we have this property right that can't be violently taken. So it changes the incentives to violence, and it changes, it's disruptive to the state business model that's built on non-consensual taxation and inflation, right? They steal money to survive. That's what the state and governments have done forever. Yeah. But now there's a money that forces them to compete.
Yeah. Now you mentioned a key word right there, and you said sovereign. And when we were talking before we started recording, you were talking about you're about to go live the sovereign individual life, which is referencing a book called The Sovereign Individual, which is an amazing book written, I think, in '89. That is an amazing read. Everybody should go read it. I'll link to it in the show notes. But in your report, you talked about, or in that last article, you talked about sovereignty, how really the word sovereignty had reign in it, and how it was really for kings to be sovereign. They were reigning. But then it was extended to the nobles, and then eventually it was extended to the people. and how really individuals now should be sovereign. And that's something that we want. I want to be a sovereign individual.
Mhm.
And how really we're not able to do that, but maybe Bitcoin helps us with that. Could you expand on that?
Absolutely. So sovereignty refers to the locus of supreme power in the world. And another way to think about that is that if whoever is sovereign has the authority to act as they see fit, right? And the arc of human history has been the gradual decentralization of sovereignty. So we kind of, and the extreme example I give is the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. You had like a couple of super sovereign individuals overseeing a bunch of slaves, right? Essentially, a bunch of non-sovereign citizens. Then you fast forward to kind of a monarchical structure that has more of a sovereign aristocracy with a serfdom below them. And then today in Western civilization, the cornerstone and the bedrock of all of Western civilization is the presupposition that the sovereignty of the individual is superordinate to the sovereignty of the state. So that, and this is embodied in like innocent until proven guilty, habeas corpus or right to a fair trial, freedom of speech rights, all these things that our social system honors this ability of the individual to act freely in the world, right? And it's the whole thing has been moving closer toward what I would call, or what is called, natural law, right? So natural law essentially says that this sacred power we call sovereignty, it actually inheres within the individual. This is not something that's given to us from government, right? It's not like we're born and then a government gives us rights that we can use. It's we're all born with right to life, to liberty, and to property, right? And as long as we honor that in one another, then society flourishes. And if we don't, society falls. And history bears that out, right? Debasement of the monetary medium, which again is a violation of everyone's private property rights, a violation of their sovereignty, always precedes civilizational collapse. So we've been down this road before. It's crazy to me that history, the lessons of history haven't been learned, but we're still out here trying to print our way out of disaster. And I just think the opposite is true. If we maximize the sovereignty of the individual and minimize frictions to trade, that's how we create the most abundance in the world.
Yeah.
And Bitcoin supports both of those. It maximizes holder sovereignty. You don't need anyone's permission to do anything. You can do whatever you want with your money. You're your own central bank, effectively, if you're running your own full node. And it minimizes all barriers. Like, no one can stop your Bitcoin transaction. So all of these things, I think, support this the sovereign individual thesis we're moving into.
Yeah. You just mentioned something, how you think so it's been tried in all these different countries, and history is full of examples of when you take away the sovereign rights of an individual, how the society suffers. And it's not just history. I don't know, 2/3 of the world or more are living under these totalitarian type regimes and living in extreme poverty. And then you have a couple countries that have brought people out of poverty. And so we can see it around
Yep,
us. You
that's
said
right.
that you think it's crazy that people don't know this or haven't been educated in. But is it crazy or is it intentional?
You're absolutely correct. The university curriculum is largely influenced by the state that funds and subsidizes a lot of it, which is, again, all of that funding is intimately related to the central bank, right? And the extreme example of this would be an economics degree. You can get a master's degree in economics at the top tier Ivy League institution like Harvard. You will not hear one peep of Austrian economics. And Austrian economics is the sum total of human knowledge about economics throughout all of history up until the past 200 years. I mean, there's still been advancements for the past 200 years, but it's been suppressed in favor of Keynesian economics, which is pretty much central bank propaganda, right? It's just their excuse for increasing the money supply and monopolizing the money supply. But it's so, yeah, I say I think it's crazy, but you're right. I do think there's an element of intentionality to it.
Yeah, I recently tweeted a quote from Henry Ford where he said, you know, if the people knew how the banking system worked, there'd be a revolution overnight, and that was
That's
100
right.
years ago, and it's only gotten
Yeah.
worse. And so you think about that, and so then the inverse of that, right? Well, shoot, we can't let the people know
Yeah.
because there
Yeah.
will be a revolution overnight. And I think that actually leads a lot to where we are at in the world today. So pre-COVID, a lot of people don't know this because the media was pretty silent, but pre-COVID, there was maybe 6 or 8 different countries in the world with 1 million+ people protesting. We
Hmm.
have now that's starting back up. We're seeing a lot of it happening
Yeah.
in Europe and even in the US, obviously massive social unrest. And it seems like everybody's mad and everybody realizes the system's not just, it's rigged against them, but they don't know why.
That's
Do
right.
you see that?
I agree completely. And it's popular in Bitcoin circles, this meme, fix the money, fix the world. Um, but if you really start to evaluate money deeply and realize that it shapes the world for us, right? I think Charlie Munger said, like, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome, right? If you have theft integrated into money, which is intended to be the thing that you hold and have no need to trust anyone else. It's supposed to be the trust minimized store of value. That's what gold was, right? But now we have this form of money that's confiscated from all the time, right? So another way to think about this is money as a claim on the savings of humanity, right? All the savings in the world in terms of capital, services, whatever we can provide collectively as society, money gives you a claim on that because you can go and spend money to get anything in the marketplace.
Right.
When that is perpetually siphoned off of, it actually distorts the incentives in the economy, right? So, and it pushes people away from productive work and into occupations that are much more heavily involved with rent seeking. And one example of this would be healthcare in the US. There's a great website for this, by the way, WTF1971.com. But if you look at the growth in hospital administrators versus healthcare providers since 1971, the administratorship has exploded relative to the number of providers. So the bureaucracy in healthcare has exploded, but the value add, the providers, hasn't, right? So the incentives have changed in healthcare such that it has become more of a value extractive function versus being an additive function, economic function. When your money, you can't store your work value, time, and money reliably, you are pushed to rent seek. You're pushed to play power games to get as near to the fiat currency spigot as you can, right? You're pushed to get your company too big to fail. Because all of a sudden, if you're too big to fail, you have a perpetual free roll on society. So it causes governments to get bigger, it causes companies to get bigger, it eviscerates the middle class and small businesses. And it just wildly distorts all the economic incentives that we typically rely on in a free market paradigm to support our civilizational advance, right?
Right.
In a free market, everyone's competing based on their own self-interest, but they have incentives to innovate and to sell things more cheaply. So the free market's constantly pumping out innovations, lower prices, accurate price discovery. And central banking, again, when I say it's an institution of socialism, I'm not exaggerating. In the 1848 Manifesto of the Communist Party, it's Marx's fifth measure is the central bank. That's where we get it. It's purely an institution of socialism. It throws all of that into disarray, right? Price discovery is completely fucked, as we see in the stock market today. We have stock market at all-time highs, 40 million people unemployed. Innovation suffers. Just look at anything near the state, right? Like healthcare, government. Or another way to think about this is, how is your customer service experience at the DMV versus the Apple store, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's socialism versus capitalism, basically.
Yeah.
And then it also, as I go into in the piece, it incentivizes moral wickedness, because inflation has this corrosive effect on people. Like, even if they don't cognitively understand it, when you're being stolen from all the time, you're incentivized to deceive your customers in the short run to basically maintain your financial integrity. And this just radiates out into the economy, and it's very poisonous for
Yeah.
society.
I mean, these are all such great points that I would imagine the average person has never really dug in this deep to think about it. And really that's why these subjects are difficult, because you really have to kind of master so many levels. And this is kind of like a philosophical debate. Um, we've obviously talked about a lot of the problems that this creates, but where does the rubber meet the road for the average person? So now somebody listening might say, well, shoot, now I understand why there's all this social unrest around the world and in the United States as well. Um, okay, so the central bank is stealing from me, printing, but like, where does the rubber meet the road? What are they going to do about it? I mean, should people go vote? Or should they be a sovereign individual like you are and start traveling the world? Or what are you seeing?
Um, the first investment anyone should make is doing what they're doing right now. If they're watching this, invest in your education, invest, think critically for yourself. Like, none of us have all the answers. That's why I always strive as a student of the market to listen to the market, to understand that the market is more intelligent than I could ever hope to be, right? It's the sum total of all of our cognitive abilities. And the market is telling the world right now that Bitcoin is the best performing asset in human history. Nothing has ever grown this fast. You have to pay attention to that. I don't care how ideologically aligned against it you are, right? You could be the most fervent believer in central banking. You still have to pay attention to the market when it's spitting out the fastest growing asset in human history. So definitely education first. I think Bitcoin is interesting in that when your understanding is far away from it, people tend to feel more averse to it. It's so radical, it's hard to understand. But as you close that gap through an investment in education and studying it, you become more bullish, actually, which is weird because I've looked at a lot of projects in my career, and you tend to maybe get a little more excited in the beginning and then start to see the shortcomings as you get closer to it.
Mm-hmm.
But Bitcoin's the opposite. You're more bearish in the beginning, but the closer you get to it, the more bullish you become, I think. And then I encourage people to the path down the rabbit hole, I think, is that question, that very fundamental question: what is money? Like, I still ask myself this question all the time, and it just keeps opening more truth, just keeps showing you, peeling back deeper layers of society and history. And when you get to a certain point, like for me personally, I think the realization becomes very clear that just storing your savings in Bitcoin is a huge hedge against all of this economic calamity we're having in the world. And it maximizes your sovereignty, right? All of a sudden you can memorize 12 words and walk around the world with your bank account in your head, and you don't need to worry about all this counterparty risk. And it's powerful.
Yeah. Now you talked about how one of the things that you just said right there, and you're talking about like kind of competition and the government and the central bank's kind of ability to capture that and counterfeit money. And so I know one of the comments that I always see is that of course we need the competition, like the Apple Store, not like the DMV, but the government hates competition. And if the government has control of the money, which is control of the armies, which is control of the media, how would they ever allow someone to come in and take that power from them? And so that's one comment that I see all the time. So what would you say to that?
That is the $100 trillion question. If
Yeah.
Bitcoin could be stopped, it would have been stopped by now. Maybe there was an opportunity that governments missed in 2012-13 timeframe that they could have squashed the project, right? With a coordinated shutdown of miners, coordinated disparagement campaign, cutting off all ties to the traditional, to the legacy financial system. Maybe there was a chance. But now we're talking about a network that stores $200 billion in market capitalization. It has over 90% of the daily liquidity in the whole crypto asset space. So if you look at it through a technological lens, there's no turning back from that. Like, that race has already been run for money. Bitcoin has won the race for money in crypto asset world. Now it's competing with gold. Now it's competing with the US dollar, right? That's the competition that's taking place now. And there's, as far as like how a government would do it, there's not only is there case precedent, you could look at PGP, which was went to the Supreme Court. It was, people were trying to export cryptographic code. Government was trying to classify it as munitions, basically to prevent it from being exported. But it's open source code. So when they printed it, the whole thing, the whole software module on paper and put it on the desk, it was protected under freedom of speech rights per the Supreme Court here in the US. So Bitcoin falls under that case law. So there's a big uphill battle. If a government wants to outlaw Bitcoin, you would have to amend the First Amendment. You have to overturn the freedom of speech because it doesn't jive. And even if they did that, it's damn near unenforceable. It's like,
Right.
how do you turn off the internet, right? What what CEO, who do you go to shut down the internet?
Right.
There's no single centralized target to shut down. And that's what governments are really good at, right? They're good at shutting down e-gold in the 90s.
Right.
They know the guy that started it. But the beauty of Bitcoin is that it's creation myth in a way, that it's everywhere, nowhere, and it's just speech. So how do you turn it
I
off?
remember a couple years ago, Russia was trying to shut down, I believe it was Telegram, maybe it was Signal. I think they were trying to shut down. And they were trying to shut all the IPs, and it was like this game of whack-a-mole, and they had shut down like half the internet, which Amazon was down. Like all these sites were down, but they still couldn't find it. And that's not even near as decentralized. I mean, it's not even close to decentralized like Bitcoin is. And so just look at the problems they had with that, which is still pretty much a centralized application. So that's a good thing. And then to your point, right, if they can't keep drugs from becoming a billion or $1 trillion industry, and that's something physical, how are they going to stop something digital that you just remember 12 words in your head?
That's right. And then again, back to money reshaping your perception of reality. It's like whatever value structure you're operating in, that's what shapes how you see the world, right? If so this table right now is an accessory to me because I'm doing a podcast with you. But if I give someone $100 to jump over the table, all of a sudden it becomes a barrier to them, right? So it actually changes the way you see the world. And when you start to see that governments they have this dawning realization that you can't shut down Bitcoin for all the reasons we just laid out. So what's the next wise course of action is to just hold some of the network as an insurance policy against its success. So if I'm a central bank and I determine with even 0.1% probability that Bitcoin could succeed, right? If that is the case, my fiduciarily responsible tactic is to hold 0.1% of my assets in Bitcoin as a hedge against its success.
Right.
And that game theory just ratchets up. All of a sudden, central bank A is holding 0.1%. Well, central bank B says maybe we'll hold 0.2 because there's a huge incentive to adopt this money first. Those who adopt it first benefit disproportionately to later adopters. So central bank B is holding 0.2%. Central bank C says, well, we'll do 0.3%. All the while, this is increasing Bitcoin's market capitalization, right? They're buying this thing as a hedge against its success, but simultaneously supporting its future success. So that's where I think when you come to see the game theoretic dimensions of Bitcoin, you really just are all in, right? Or irresponsibly long, as Raoul Pal would say.
Yeah. So to talk about that, so a lot of people, and I see these comments, I would never buy Bitcoin, I buy gold. And I see people say, I'd never buy gold. I'd never buy Bitcoin, I'd only buy gold, or I'd never buy gold, I'd only buy Bitcoin. And people think, based off the comments, it seems like people think they have to find the one asset that's going to work and put all their money there. But as an investor and as somebody thinking about their future, I don't think that's the right way to think about it. Now, as a fund manager, how do you think people should think about it? Should they take Satoshi's quote of maybe just get a little bit in case it catches on and take that 0.1%? How should they think about dividing their assets, testing it out, or different types of assets and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, this is all expected value calculation, right? So you kind of have to, again, engage in education, homework, study, determine what percentage of a chance you think Bitcoin has of success, and then position size accordingly. Like it's it makes no sense to argue, which is a very popular argument, Bitcoin's too volatile, I can't invest in it. Volatility in your portfolio is always a function of your position size. Like if it's too volatile, that means you want a lower position in it, depending
Right.
on your risk appetite, right?
Right.
So I would say that you could think about it like that. And then as far as like Bitcoin versus gold, I'll just say that gold has a 5,000 year head start, right? That's a lot of Lindy effect, a lot of trust, a lot of inertia. That's not going anywhere anytime soon, right? It's not likely that Bitcoin's just going to take gold's monetary premium to zero overnight. It could possibly, but it could take 100 years or more. I would say that it's okay to hold both, right? But I'll also say that from a first principle standpoint of money, Bitcoin is superior across all 5 monetary properties. So that in the long run, the economic long run, I do believe gold as money goes to zero. Like it goes to its industrial use value, and Bitcoin consumes the entire market for money because again, it's perfectly divisible, durable, recognizable, portable. And as I argue in some of my writing, Bitcoin is the discovery of absolute scarcity. We've never had any asset in history that we knew with perfect certainty there would never be more than 21 million of. Everything physical in the world is just a function of our time necessary to produce it.
Right.
Bitcoin is could be the first constant in human action, right? And that's the big argument in Austrian economics is there are no constants in human action. There's death and taxes, right?
Right. Yeah.
But now we have this third certainty. We have 21 million Bitcoin, and that is it's a game changer on every level.
Yeah. And I think to your point, it's like the more you dig in, the more you fall down that rabbit hole, the more you believe, you become a believer. And so to that point that you said, as well as, your encouragement for people to educate themselves, I would say any objection that you have, if you spend a little bit of time researching into that, you'll continue to find how genius it really is. Right.
Absolutely true. And I would add that I spent a lot of time looking for counter arguments to Bitcoin. Like I've always been asking myself the $100 trillion question. How do you disrupt it? How do you stop it? And what I've noticed is that the FUD is drying up very quickly. 3 years ago, it was very common for finance to just call Bitcoin a Ponzi scheme and be done with it, right? It's a joke, it's a Ponzi scheme, it'll never work. This cycle, 4 years later, no one is calling it a Ponzi scheme. No one intelligent is calling it a Ponzi scheme because It's not. It's the opposite of a Ponzi scheme. So the narrative's changing quickly. And I would say at this point, it's more risky to not pay attention and try to ignore it than to invest in some education and see the truth.
Yeah. That's so good. So we'll wrap it up on that level because you are the master educator. I would highly recommend anybody listening to go to his blog and read the post that he does, and as well as following his new YouTube channel. So, Robert, for people that do want to continue to go down that path, where is the best way they can kind of read that and keep up with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, which is my handle is my last name, which is Breedlove, BREEDLOVE, love 22. So Breedlove 22 is my Twitter handle. I post most of my writings there, which will be linked to Medium or Dig. And then you can check out our website. I have a resources page of a lot of things I like to read. And then some things that I've written. That's parallaxdigital.io, PARALLAX digital.io. And my DMs are open. You can hit me on the website or on Twitter. I get messages from all over the world all the time about all kinds of things. I try to respond to as many as I can. And the YouTube channel we just launched today, which is great timing for this.
What's the name of that?
My YouTube handle is Breedlove22. So I guess that's the name of the channel too. Still kind of new to this.
Cool. And I will put links to all that in the show notes as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign it off. Robert, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mark. This was awesome.
All right.